Wallace Budge had published and translated the Syriac text entitled Nessan of Alexandros, literally the victory of Alexander, mostly known as the Syriac Alexander legend. This Syriac text is the source of the Quranic passage in which Dhul Qarnayn appears, and as a consequence, Dhul Qarnayn is then Alexander. Although several scholars continue to refer to Alexander, many others speculated that Dhul Qarnayn might be Cyrus the Great, he might be Moses, or some king from ancient pre-Islamic Yemen. Personally, I am confident that I have no doubts. Quranic Dhul Qarnayn is Alexander, but we need to stress one important thing. We are not talking about the historical Alexander.
We are MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. I'm excited about today's episode. We're diving in to some interesting things pertaining to critical scholarship that will be in Islamic literature. And today I have Professor, and I hope I don't butcher the name, Tommaso Tesei. Am I saying it correctly?
That's correct.
Hey, I finally got it right. I was telling myself all day, all right, how do I say this? How do I say this? I got it. I'm horrible about pronunciation, but thank you for joining me here at MythVision.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. And for those who don't know, he has a website. Let me show you guys a few websites so that you can go check them out. They are in the description. This one particular is a little outdated, but nonetheless, it gives you some context. Here's his statement. Thematically, my academic interests mostly center on the emergence of the Islamic movement and faith tradition in the historical context of late antique Middle East. My recent research explores the questions of ideology, imperialism, and propaganda in Byzantine, Sasanian, and early Islamic societies. Whew. Okay. Also, he has the website, Duke University, Scholars at Duke, and you can go and check him out in the description. Do you have an academia page?
Yes, I do. It should.
I will make sure that's in the description.
Yeah, if you Google it, you will find it.
Excellent. I'll make sure I put it down in the description for our guests or our audience, so they know how to find you, because they're going to want to after this great episode. Also, I was inspired. I want to give a shout out to Terron Poole on YouTube. I'm going to link this also down in the description. So when we're done with this episode, I really want to give my friend here a shout out, because this was such an amazing episode that he did. I said, I've got to have one too. There's no reason I can't. So shout out to Terron Poole. Go subscribe to him. He's doing great work, and he did a wonderful interview with Professor Tommaso Tesei. So thank you so much for being patient with me on the intro. Now let's get into the critical thinking, and that is, well, maybe you want to lead us off in some way. How would you want to start us off when it comes to this figure in the Quran, specifically Dhul Qarnayn, if I'm saying this correctly?
Dhul Qarnayn, yeah.
Dhul Qarnayn.
So, how do we want to start? Maybe we can ask the $1 million question: who is Dhul Qarnayn? And this is something that motivated me to start this path in the academic world. I already mentioned this in my interview with Terron Poole, that I reached to this point because of Dhul Qarnayn. I really wanted to know who Dhul Qarnayn is. Let's first say what does this name or epithet Dhul Qarnayn means. It means the two-horned one, or the person with the two horns. So it's very intriguing and curious name, and generations of Quranic commentators, Arab historians, and the Western scholars tried to answer the question. And it's really, if you want, amazing that the answer is very simple, although complicated at once, but that got this very simple answer got lost in scholarship some reasons. So if you go through the earliest Quranic commentaries that we have, it looks like commentators had no doubt that this Dhul Qarnayn is Alexander the Great. However, at some point, doubts seem to have emerged, and commentators and Arab scholars in general were a bit more confused. So they advanced the different explanations. At some point, there was even the idea that there in the past there were two Dhul Qarnayns. Okay, and so. Western scholars followed a very similar trajectory, because at the end of the 19th century, we could say that scholars had all the means to answer this question, who the Dhul Qarnayn is, because maybe we can talk more about that later. But in 1889, Wallace Budge had published and translated the Syriac text that entitled Nessan of Alexandros, literally the victory of Alexander, mostly known as the Syriac Alexander legend nowadays. And 1 year later, Theodor Nöldeke published this article in which he claimed that this Syriac text is the source of the Quranic passage in which Dhul Qarnayn appears, and as a consequence, Dhul Qarnayn is then Alexander. Little by little, this information was kind of forgotten or disregarded by scholars, and all kind of theories emerged to answer the question of who Dhul Qarnayn is. So although several scholars continue to refer to Alexander, many others speculated that Dhul Qarnayn might be Cyrus the Great, he might be Moses, or some king from ancient pre-Islamic Yemen. Now, I am personally, I am confident that I have no doubts that the Quranic Dhul Qarnayn is Alexander, but we need to stress one important thing. We are not talking about the historical Alexander, okay?
Right.
Yes, you know, one of the for instance, I like sometimes to refer also to discussions outside of the ivory tower of the academic circles. So if you go on Terron Poole's interview recorded, among the comments on YouTube, there is one commentator saying that Cyrus is a much better fit for the character of Dhul Qarnayn, because Alexander, the historical Alexander, traveled from west to the east, whereas in the Quran, Dhul Qarnayn travels the other way around, from in a westwards direction. And so this commentator says Cyrus is a better fit because Cyrus also conquered the territories starting from the east and moving westwards. Okay. The problem is that in the Quran, the story of Dhul Qarnayn does not want to address the historical Alexander's conquest. Okay, it's rather reflects of how the figure of Alexander had been received and re-elaborated by Syriac Christians, and in particular by the author of this Nessan of Alexandros. Okay,
if I may, just to poke in here, this is really interesting. I want our audience to really grasp what you're saying here. So we're not dealing with like actual literal history. We're dealing with some material that others are already aware of, or there's writings already going on. I've heard of Alexander romance, things like this, but there are different kinds floating around, different things about this tradition. You even find it in Josephus. There's a tradition where we talk about Alexander the Great he found the literature of Daniel. Yeah. And like, there's these traditions of Alexander the Great, a great conqueror. So as we get into this, if you don't mind, maybe you're already going to do this, but I'm just trying to like make sure people know what time we're talking about. When is this literature around? Is it before the Quran that we're actually seeing this literature in the Syriac Christian circles? And then all of a sudden it finds itself here in the Quran?
Yeah, okay, this is an excellent question. Thank you for asking, because it's important to clarify. So this Syriac work, the Nesana de Alexandros, where Alexander is represented in a way that coincides with the way Dhul Qarnayn is represented in the Quran. So this Nesana de Alexandros was composed, I would say, several decades before the Quran, although I mean, it's extremely tricky, because there is a lot of debate about the exact period of composition of the Quranic pericopian Dhul Qarnayn, and so. But let's say that if we want to take the traditional setting, so around the 20s of the 7th century, the Nesana de Alexandros, in that case, was composed 7 or 8 decades earlier. It's a work that was composed during the reign of Justinian, and in a very specific historical and political context, that of the clash between the Byzantine Empire and the Sasanian Empire. And
this is in the 550s, right? If I'm not mistaken.
I mean, in the 6th century, we have a long series of conflicts between Byzantines and Sasanians. At several points, the emperors on the two empires tried to reach an agreement, which was never some kind of final and conclusive agreement to end the hostilities. But yeah, it's this work must have been composed, I think, somewhere around 540 or 560. Between 540 and 560. So the point is that several decades later, it was re-updated, okay? So somebody must have read this story of Alexander defeating the Persians, and Alexander blocking access to the Huns coming from the inner regions of Central Asia. And reading the story, he found a very close parallel to the historical reality under his eyes. That is the one of the reign of Heraclius, okay? And this person must have thought that, oh, you see, this what's going on now with the Heraclius defeating the Sasanians was already predicted in the past. Let me add a very small gloss to this text to connect the text to this historical reality. And this is a phenomenon that is very common in literature, especially when we are talking of the specific genre of apocalyptic writings.
Yeah.
So, and is something that must have happened. What is relevant and important for us is that this gives us an indication that this story of Alexander, this Nesana de Alexandros, was popular in the around the 20s or the 30s of the 7th century, and it was quite broadly circulating, because we have several sources that were inspired by this work. So this is something that we want to keep in mind when we talk about the Quranic pericope of Dhul Qarnayn.
If I may, I want to press this a little deeper in that character specifically to get your thoughts. You know how we talk about they updated things? I'm literally relying on you as an expert, because I don't really know this, but I have a question that maybe is a good one, I hope. Dhul Qarnayn, I hope I'm saying this right. He is, as you're saying, Alexander the Great, but is he kind of painted in, let's say, the Quraysh tribe, in an image of the Quraysh tribe, or and they're painting him in their image, kind of like you're saying. Maybe Syriac Christians or other Christians around this time are writing these famous stories, watching what's going on between Rome and Persia, and they're writing it from their angle. And maybe the Quran's narrative that is using the story is writing in a reaction. Is that possible?
Okay, so this is a very good question as well. You ask a lot of good questions. So
Thank you.
If you one day you will join one of my classes, will be very useful, because it's very useful to have somebody who asks this kind of question. So this question you ask at the same time is very difficult to answer, because it opens up to a set of related questions. First of all, in which context this Quranic pericope was composed? You mentioned the setting of Mecca, so the Meccan setting. However, we can wonder whether this story of Dhul Qarnayn was composed exactly in that setting, which is possible. We can imagine that the story became so well known and popular that it reached to the Hijaz. But we can also think that when the first Arab communities started their territorial expansion and reached to the areas where these narratives had been conceived and composed, maybe it is that the setting in which the Dhul Qarnayn story was composed. So it's very difficult to locate it geographically, okay, in our map of the Quran. And I should clarify one thing. There is a very known, famous, even infamous theory that the Quran was not composed in Western Central Arabia, that is in the Hijaz, but somewhere in northern Mesopotamia. And this is not a theory that I embrace. It's not something that I consider to be correct. I think that my personal theory is that we should think of the Quran as a more fluid corpus of text, more of some kind of working process that developed during the first decades of the Muslim, or even better, proto-Muslim territorial expansion. Okay, so if there are sections of the Quran that I have no doubt were composed in the context of Hijaz, I have more doubts about older sections of the Quran. Okay. As for what you were asking, is this a reaction to the image of Alexander elaborated by Syriac Christians? I mean, one thing that surely catches the eyes in the Quranic pericope is that the complete lack of interest for the role of the Roman Empire in sacred history, which is a very central topic to the Syriac Alexander legend. Okay, to some extent, the elaboration of Alexander of the figure of Alexander that we see in this work is functional to the ideology that the author wants to proclaim. That is, that the Roman Empire plays a central role in God's plan for human salvation. Okay, so this is completely absent in the Quran. Why it is so is a question that requires a lot of investigation, and I don't have a final answer at this in this moment. But for sure, the Quran is more interested in adapting this story of Alexander to its own theological purposes. So, and of course, the theological element that the Quran wants to proclaim is not that the Roman Empire will conquer the world to welcome the Messiah. What the Quran wants to proclaim with this Dhul Qarnayn narrative is that Dhul Qarnayn, or Alexander, built a eschatological gate that is holding this apocalyptic invasion. But once this gate will be removed, that's the moment when the judgment will arrive, and there will be the redistribution of penalties or rewards.
What is this gate? Is this like if we were going back in time and we were there, let's say, I know that you have to speculate sometimes, but maybe you have reasons to think what you think. Imagine I'm in the in the 630s, 40s. Let's say the Quran is being developed at this time. This is before we see Uthman's, standardized text on the scene, if we grant that that's when it's standardized. And we hear about this apocalyptic gate. Was there somewhere geographically or locally, were there an enemy? Was there a territory where they thought there's this big gate over here, and they thought maybe a soon apocalypse? Like, I read the New Testament and I see it. It's all over the New Testament. It's the end is near, the end is near. But I wonder if there's somewhere locally, what is that gate? And did they think that there was some place nearby and it was soon?
Thank you. Yeah, this is
sorry.
This is no. Thank you. It's very useful because you are asking all these useful questions that help me to explain better what the situation is. So the gate, yes. Let's say that we are at the crossroad between myth and reality. That is that something that started as probably as some kind of legend, then came to be connected to real history with attempts to historicize the legend, and then it went back to the legend. So let me clarify how it happened. We already in Josephus, we read about these reports of Alexander traveling to the northern Caucasus. So we are in the area of modern Georgia, where he allegedly built some iron gates to block the mountain passes. Okay, probably this never happened because Alexander probably never arrived there. But what is relevant for us is that people started to believe this to be true. Okay, and people started to make attempts to identify the site, the geographical location of these gates. Okay, and there were a lot of debates, a lot of confusion, but at some point the site of Alexander's Gate came to be identified with the Dariali Pass in modern Georgia. It's at the border between Georgia and Russia nowadays. And this site was attributed the name of Caspian Gates. Okay. And now we know there have been recently extensive archaeological investigations that there were actual fortifications in this area. It's a very narrow gorge, so it's very strategically important place, because with a handful of soldiers you could just block some very relevant and massive invasions of Hunnic population from Central Asia. And there were fortifications, and probably there were also iron gates put there to block the pass. Now, in the 6th century,
if I may, just what date are those gates up? Just so we're tracking with you in time. When were they actually archaeologically dated to be around when they existed?
Well, it's very difficult because I mean, I'm not an archaeologist, but of course I read all the literature, the recent literature on that point. I think there must have been fortifications already around the 3rd century, third century. What is more relevant is that around the end of the 5th and the beginning of the 6th century, these fortifications were renewed, okay, and strengthened to probably as a reaction to the Hunnic invasion of the late 4th century. Okay, so we witness a process of investments by a political authority to strengthen these fortifications.
And who are the people strengthening it? Just so they know, is it Persia or is it?
That's the point. So it looks like it was mainly the Persians who invested in these fortifications. We have some archaeological witnesses, some coins from the Sasanian Empire. What is more relevant is that this site of the Caspian gates became a real source of contention among Byzantines and Sasanians, because at some point towards the end of the 5th century, Sasanian emperors increasingly demanded money, subventions from the Romans to guard these Caucasian passes. So the idea was that the Persians were doing a service for both empires to defend them from the incursions and the raids of Hunnic population from Central Asia. And in the 6th century, this became so problematic, the situation, that the Persians even used this as a casus belli in several occasions. When the Romans refused to pay these subventions in money to the Persians, mostly out of fear that this could be represented as tributes. That is, we are paying tributes to the Persians. We don't want to be represented as such. When the Romans refused to pay, Persian emperors started a series of conflicts. Of course, it's not only because of that, but it was used as a casus belli, and this question of the Caspian Gates frequently occurs in peace treaties in the 6th century. So all of a sudden, we see that this ancient question of the Caspian Gates became extremely relevant. It's insane the number of references that you can see in 6th century sources. I'm not good at statistics, but I imagine that if you would trace a diagram of the references to the Caspian Gates, you could see something like this, and then in the 6th century, something like this. And because they became a real and thorny political issue. Now, at the same time, 6th century authors keep on attributing the construction of these iron gates to Alexander. Okay, so this is the setting. What does this Syriac author do? He takes this Alexander legend of the iron gates and he turns it into a very politically oriented narrative. Okay. According to which, what he wants to say basically is that these gates were built first by Alexander, these fortifications there. Alexander is represented as the ancestor of the Roman Empire. So the author is claiming for the Roman Empire a central role in containing the invasion of the Huns. It's something like to rebut these claims made by the Persians. But it's not the only thing he does.
When is this? What's the date on that? Just so people are in the date. The 6th century, right? You say 500 something?
6th century. Yeah, we are at around the turn of the 6th century. I would say when in the middle of the 6th century. Sorry, when this question of the Caspian Gates became the extremely central element in Roman foreign policy. And but it's not the only thing he does. He inserts this narrative of the Alexander Gate into a more complex intellectual and ideological framework. So the gate is not only put there to stop the Huns. Okay, the author he reads the story through the lens of biblical exegesis. He does something that is not completely new in identifying the Huns with the people of Gog and Magog, that according to the biblical tradition will come towards the end. Okay, and then this Alexander's Gate becomes some kind of eschatological portal, a tool through which God will keep those apocalyptic nations in their place until the final decree. Okay.
Oh, wow.
So, and the gate becomes really the image of the role that Rome is playing in sacred history. So first of all, I already mentioned this in the interview with Terron, that we have a very significant narrative shift. The iron gates of the Alexander traditions become a gate of iron and brass for a very specific reason, because the author wants to hint to the symbolism in the book of Daniel, in which the third empire of world history, the empire of the Greeks, is represented by the bronze, and the fourth empire, the empire of the Romans, is represented by the iron. Our author uses this metaphor of the iron and the brass just to describe the Greco-Roman Empire. In another passage of the Syriac world, we read that the empire of the Romans will arrive with a hammer of bronze in its left hand and a hammer of iron in its right hand, and it will smith the two hammers together to destroy the other kingdoms of the world. So this of the iron and the bronze is a very important image for our author, and he uses this to conceptualize Alexander's Gate, which becomes just the image of the mixture of these two empires, the Greco-Roman Empire, okay? And it's even more complex than that. I don't want to enter into the details. I have a forthcoming monograph on this point, but a very fascinating scriptural background to the story is also that there is an implicit reference to the idea of a katechon, the restraining force that, according to the letter to the Thessalonians, will hold the coming of the Antichrist. So that the Alexander's Gate becomes a symbol of the function that as a katechon that the Roman Empire is playing in secret history. So all of this happens thanks to this author.
Wow. So there's a lot there. There's the very apocalyptic mindset, just like we hear with Dr. Shoemaker, who discusses the apocalypticism of these empires. And I can't wait to interview him again, of course, to discuss that further. But I'd like to just probe onto what we're finding in the Quran. Now that we are aware, there's tradition, and it's clear that there's an awareness of this, not only gates, but also this character, Dhul Qarnayn, and his role being Alexander the Great with these gates. What is looking at the Quran, like what is purposefully, like you talked about some things left out. Is there any evidence of things that are put in that might tell us something of the author's intent with this story?
Yeah, excellent question. Yeah, because very often what is most meaningful when comparing a Quranic passage to a parallel source in authentic sources is not really the common points, whereas the differences. Now, I already mentioned the lack of interest for the role of the Roman Empire. Okay, and this is a very important thing. One might speculate that there is some kind of connection to some reactions that were already common among Syriac Christians, and not everybody was on board with this idea of the Roman Empire as playing a central role. But I'm not completely confident with this, so it's something that I will need to clarify. There is an element that is very interesting. When we read about Dhul Qarnayn's travel to the west, the place of the sunset, okay? We read that Dhul Qarnayn is given an opportunity to either punish the people in it at that place, or to treat them with kindness. And Dhul Qarnayn, to some extent, answers this possibility is given, saying basically anticipating what will happen in the day of judgment. Okay, so we already have there a focus on the idea that rewards and punishments will be redistributed according to individual behavior. And this is something that we don't have in the Nesana of Alexandros. In the Nesana of Alexandros, we read that when Alexander reaches to the western edges of the earth, he meets a body of poisonous waters. And to test those waters, he sent some evildoers, some prisoners condemned to death, into the waters to test the waters, and the prisoners die. So there is no kind of moralizing attempt, if you want. There is no attempt to insert any kind of a reminder about the judgment and redistribution of punishments and rewards. So this is something unique to the Quranic account, and I think it's significant because it tells us what the interest of the author is with the story. It's not oriented towards the ideology, the apocalyptic imperial ideology that we found in the Nesana. Is more adapted to the Quranic theology.
So technically, if I may, to break this down for our audience, this sounds very apocalyptic. And it is, but does this imply potentially something near? When I look in the New Testament, I know, this generation will not pass away. These things are expected to happen soon. And from what I gather from other Islamic scholars, that everybody has like apocalyptic fever, if I can use the term. It's coming soon. Everybody's ready for the end to happen. I suspect the author of the Quran, or whoever they may be in that literature, is thinking that as well. And, I'm reminded of the interesting hadith where he talks about the two fingers, and he's like, is the distance between my two fingers, So do you think this plays a role in, like, did they expect something soon with this story?
It might very well be. It might very well be. Again, if you want to address this question through the parallel of the Nesana, in the original 6th century Nesana, we have the evidence that the author did not believe that the end was coming anytime soon. He basically connect invasion of the Huns occurred in 521 to an invasion of the Huns of Gog and Magog, but he says that this is not the final invasion. This is something that the final invasion will come in the future. However, it is possible that when a second devastating raid from the Turkish population from Central Asia happened around in the late 20s of the 7th century.
Near Heraclius.
Exactly. Okay. Exactly. It's very possible that some people interpreted this as a sign that those people coming through the gates built by Alexander were the sign of the end coming. Now, what is the exact take of the Quranic author on this point? I couldn't tell. It is possible, certainly, that the author believed that the end was coming soon, and that he used the story of Alexander, implying that the Gog and Magog had already started to come, so as a sign of the end. But for sure, this is not made it so clear in the Quranic account. Again, it is certainly a possibility. It's not the only possibility. And another thing that apocalypticism is for sure a main theme in the Quran. Although some scholars have tried to downplay to downplay this aspect in favor of other aspects. Okay. At the same time, we need to be extremely careful in trying to derive, extrapolate a coherent ideology from the Quran, okay? And a coherent ideology from the early Islamic community or proto-Muslim community. I mean, my perspective is that the situation was much more complex and fluid than just saying it was either then a kind of out. It's either an apocalyptic movement or not.
Right.
I'm sure there were different currents within the community, with different stances about this apocalyptic ideology. Some people might have been totally convinced that the end was coming. Other people might not have shared this point of view. So we should be very careful in tracing just the straight lines and saying things went that way.
Yeah, that methodology's always got me in trouble in New Testament studies, because you find a doctrine and you think, oh, it says this, and then you want it to fit in the rest of the literature, and you're forcing square pegs in round holes and they don't fit. So if I may, as we're leaving this particular topic, I just wanted to briefly touch on a few things, because we'll probably need to do more episodes to really dive deep. But if you could just highlight, you don't have to go deep, because I really want to follow up with you on things if you have more to say. Can you highlight if there are any places in the Quran which we clearly see this would be a tradition? Dhul Qarnayn is obviously a tradition of Alexander. It seems pretty clear. Are there any places in the Quran where you see either awareness of the Jewish literature, what we would call, let's say, the Mishnah or the Talmud? Is there anywhere in the Quran where there are other Christian traditions, like I hear the people who sleep in the cave? Like, and how do we know, like, there's some type of connection, but we may not see a genetic connection, but there's a connection?
Yeah, this is very interesting, because first of all, we need to point out one thing, that scholars recently have highlighted some inconsistencies that emerge when comparing the social and religious background that emerges when reading the Quran to what we find in the Islamic tradition. And this is especially true when we address the case of the so-called mushrikun, those that the Quran describes as associators. When you go into the tradition, these associators are normally depicted as a community of polytheist idolaters, whereas in the Quran they're mostly represented as some kind of corrupted monotheist and worshippers of angels. So we have this kind of dichotomy and not completely coherent picture. With Christianity and Christians is exactly the same. Okay, when you read the traditional stories about the preaching of Muhammad, Christians play a very marginal role, especially as compared to, again, polytheists and Jews, okay? The role of the Jews in, especially in Yathrib, Medina, is acknowledged by the tradition, and so it makes sense to find Jewish traditions in the Quran from, you know. Yeah. What doesn't really make sense is the relevance that the Quran attributes to Christianizing elements, I would say. You find Christianizing elements almost everywhere in the Quran, okay? Now, when this is one thing that we need to keep in mind. As for the story of Dhul Qarnayn, we need also to point out that it's a very peculiar case, because we're not talking about the stories about Jesus, okay, that were very well known Okay, you can imagine that the oral tradition about Jesus was very widespread, so you don't really need to say, okay, this is a story of Jesus necessarily comes from this specific source.
Right.
The case of Dhul Qarnayn is peculiar because in this case we can say, yes, it comes exactly from this specific source. We don't have any other tradition describing this narrative plot.
So when Sean Anthony, for example, is trying to connect the sleepers in his book, his historical Muhammad book, he comes to the conclusion, like, we don't know the exact source that it's using, but there's enough there to know that the tradition somehow did find its way in. Is that what you're trying to suggest?
Okay, the sleepers of Ephesus is another thing, because actually Sean is right on this point. We cannot trace the story of the companions in the cave in the Quran to a specific version of the sleepers of Ephesus. But the story of Dhul Qarnayn, I think it's different, because in that case we can trace it back to a specific source.
Right.
After that, we can debate whether this is some kind of a direct influence or if it was mediated through other chains of transmissions, and it's something that I plan to investigate in the coming years. But I'm confident that we can say this is the starting point. Okay. Whereas with other stories like the one of the companions in the cave, the thing is a bit more blurred, so it's a bit more different. However, since you mentioned the story of the sleepers of Ephesus, we should mention also that the Surat al-Kahf, where the story of the companions in the cave and Dhul Qarnayn are found, is very particular itself, okay, for several reasons. First of all, because the narratives that we find there are unique to that surah. That is, they do not occur elsewhere in the Quran.
Right.
Again, is example stories about Jesus. You will find several parallel versions of the same story or different stories all across the Quranic corpus.
Right.
You will not find mentions of Dhul Qarnayn elsewhere in the Quran. You will not find mentions of the companions in the cave elsewhere in the Quran. It's true that there is a passage in another surah that mentions Gog and Magog, but it doesn't mention Dhul Qarnayn. So these are really references restricted to that specific surah. And then there is another narrative that it's also very famous, is the narrative of Moses' journey to the Majma al-Bahrain, the junction of the two seas, and Moses' encounter with the servant of God. Now, this is also an interesting story for several reasons. First of all, because the first part, the first 5 verses of this pericope also derive from some legends about Alexander. All in the Quran, the protagonist is Moses. And second, even if we disregard this factor, the Moses we find here is a very different Moses from other stories in the Quran. We have a Moses who appears as very impatient. It's so striking, the situation, that we have a very interesting narrative structure. In the first part of the story, Moses travels together with his own servant, and he basically asks his servant to wash a fish to prepare some meal. Then we have this curious episode of the fish that comes back to life, and this is connected to the story of the water of life. However, the servant, when he's asked, where is the food? Where is the fish? He says, oh, I forgot about that. And it was Satan who made me forget about this. Now, this is an interesting element, because in the following part of this story, Moses travels together with his servant of God, And Moses vows to be patient and not to question the actions of the servant of God. And when he actually doesn't keep his word, the servant of God tells him, what are you doing? You promised that you wouldn't do that. He says, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot about that, using exactly the same words that in the previous part. So it's implicitly something that earlier Satan caused the Moses servant to forget. In the following part, it's not specified that it is Satan who caused this, but the doubt remains. So it's very interesting to see that you have a prophet there who does something that it's not so well defined. And this is kind of inconsistent with the Quranic theology that is usually more oriented towards, if you allow me the expression, to clean up the image of its prophets. For instance, you know, in other passages in the Quran, when we have a reference to the episode of Moses striking with his stick on the rock from which the water gushes. In biblical traditions and in rabbinic commentaries in particular, we have this act as interpreted like an act of impatience, because Moses strikes twice with a stick. And we have no mention of this in the Quran. So in the Quran, elsewhere in the Quran, we see that Moses appears as a more kind of, as a less problematic figure, as it could be in some kind of biblical tradition. Not in the Surah Al-Kahf. In Surah Al-Kahf, we have a Moses who is really problematic. He doesn't basically understand what's going on. He doesn't understand God's wish that takes place through the actions of the servant of God. And it's so puzzling what's going on that some Quranic commentators even questioned that this Moses is the actual Moses. Some Quranic commentators were wondering whether this is another Moses.
Did they do that during the Middle Ages? I suspect when they were really able to challenge things, or because that's something I would hear that there, but you don't have to answer that. I have actually another question specifically. Does this in any way, do you think some of these traditions are coming from the Talmud? Or are there any examples that the Quran seems to be aware of the Talmud and using literature or using something from the Talmud? Do you know of any or no?
Okay, yeah, I think that, well, the person to ask this kind of questions is my colleague Holger Zellentin, who worked extensively on these kind of questions. I'm sure that, yeah, there are places in the Quran where you find traditions that can seem to, if not be derived, at least to be very close to some traditions in the Talmud. In Surah Al-Kahf, it's not the case. So staying, for instance, with the story of Moses, although some early scholars tried to relate this Moses story to a specific Jewish environment, this proved not to be the case, because the story has been compared to another tradition about Elijah, I think, and it turned out that probably this Jewish tradition was inspired by the Quranic passage and not the other way around. Okay, the problem is that the scholar who pointed out this situation neglected a more important fact. That is that the story of Moses and the servant of God in the Quran has a much closer parallel in a Christian legend that is reported by a Christian writer, John Moscus, who was active in the early 7th century. And if I don't remember exactly the date, but I think that this, I'm sorry, I'm looking on
no problem.
laptop. If I'm right, this John Moscus died around 619 So we are very close to the period of the Quran.
Is this legend about Jesus being the rock and Moses hitting the rock? Because I know in the New Testament, there's a strange passage that the Apostle Paul says, which is very unique, that Christ was the rock that was with them in the wilderness as they were journeying. And that Moses, I think, I could be wrong, but they got their water from Christ. And I don't know. I kind of wonder if there's something to it.
This is a very interesting subtext. It's something that I have been starting to investigate, but at this point I don't have an answer for this because I am still a very preliminary process of my intellectual analysis. So I don't want to take the risk of saying things.
Okay, no problem. I just
but it's a very interesting passage that you mentioned, and it might be. But in the story of John Moscus, we rather read about a monk who encounters and travel together with an angel, and the dynamic is very close to that of the journey between Moses and the servant of God in the Quran.
Will you be publishing on this? I would love to see you publish on this at some point, by the way.
At some point in the future. I mean, I'm still trying to determine my research trajectory for the next few years. Now I spent a few years writing this book about the Alexander legend, the Syriac Alexander legend, and my goal was to kind of take a bit of distance from Quranic studies and try to explore other things. But Terron Poole first, and you are trying to drag me back to the study of Quranic origins. So I am realizing that it's not so easy to get out of Quranic studies. So to answer your question, probably yes, I will write on this in the future.
Okay, so there's so much. Tommaso, I wonder if we should, is there anything more you want to say about Dhul Qarnayn and the context of that? And before you go, I'm opening up a can of worms with this question because it's so big. You won't be able to answer it, but it makes me wonder, based on how we've been discussing the context of the Quran, like, how do you see the development of the Quran? You know what I mean? Like, there are people who think that Muhammad actually dictated this, or is it a collection of scribes, or did this, maybe you have an idea of what you think, a hypothesis of what you think, how the development of the Quran happened. What is the terminus ad quem and terminus ad quo, if you will, of, when you might, because that, I think, wouldn't dating also kind of put you in the mode of like who wrote it or where and when and things like that, or what you might come up with?
Okay, so instead of establishing some very clear chronological settings, terminus post and ante quem, termina post and ante quem, I would rather, first of all, try to dismiss myth, which is very common in the study of the Quran. And this is the idea that if the Quran was indeed canonized, or at least put to writing around the reign of Uthman, or let's say 1 or 2 decades after the traditional date of the death of Muhammad. So if this was true, then there would not be enough time for the text to undergo substantial changes. And I think that this is just untenable, because it bases on several assumptions that really I don't share, especially if you consider the historical circumstances that we can understand the things that happened. So if you think about this small community that grew exponentially, okay, we don't know exactly what happened, but we can just know that at some point this community expanded, and was able to receive a lot of new adepts. Okay. At the same time, you want to think that the original, so to speak, always allow me this expression, the people who witnessed the events and even the preaching of Muhammad passed away, maybe for several reasons. So you really can say that we are in the perfect situation for a dilution of memory. Okay. Right. New people wanted to know what was happening in the historical context of prophets Muhammad, but there were not many people who could answer this question. Okay. Now that in these circumstances, revelation that most likely was transmitted mostly orally could not be open to external influences, and I mean additions, glosses, re-elaborations, texts that were changed, texts that were composed anew and attributed to Muhammad, saying that this could not have happened in a couple of decades, to me, is completely unrealistic. We are in a situation in which the world, the political order that the world had known for centuries, just was completely deleted within a couple of decades. The world dramatically changed. So we are in a situation, in this bizarre situation in which the world, the political order, and everything can change very fast. But the text that was not even written down couldn't change. I mean, to me, this sounds a very dogmatic assumption. So then we need to start thinking of the Quran as a more fluid process that I have no doubts that it includes parts of Muhammad's preaching.
Right.
But I can't accept the idea that it's absolutely impossible that materials post-dating Muhammad couldn't make the way within the corpus. I mean, it's something that, again, to me sounds very dogmatic.
Yeah, I'm with you, by the way. Oh, go ahead.
As for when it was, when the text started assuming its final, also we are using a terminology that it's very tricky, because we know that there were several parallel readings and traditions, but let's say what we can call some kind of Vulgata. When this happened, I couldn't say. I would say in general no later than the end of the 7th century. I have nothing against the possibility that this happened by the mid of the 7th century. I am more interested in trying to dismantle this scholarly ideology that somehow the single authorship of the Quran must be defended at any cost.
Yeah.
Whereas if we abandon this, again, this dogmatic view, things start making more sense, at least from my perspective.
Yeah, that's really interesting. If I were to compare it to the Apostle Paul's literature, decades after the time that Jesus was preaching, I see big differences. And that's not even the rise of an empire. This is a small movement that is not really big at all. And Paul does not even agree with the teachings that you would imagine Jesus is teaching. So, you know, using another analogy just to point that out. So I really appreciate you. Was there anything you needed to say about Dhul Qarnayn as we are exiting this episode?
Going back to our initial question about who Dhul Qarnayn is. I mean, in general, to me, it sounds very much like, how do you call it? The duck test. If it swims like a duck, he quack like a duck, then maybe it's a duck. So, and with Dhul Qarnayn, it's the same. I mean, if he builds a gate like Alexander did, if he is a prophet like Alexander is represented in this Syriac text, if he has horns as this Alexander, as in the text, for a reason which is very much connected to the author's ideology, then we have all these coincidences. Then in the end, yeah, it might be Alexander and not Moses or Hammurabi, as I read recently. So
thank you so much. This has been an absolute blast. Tommaso, is it Tesei?
Tesei, but as I
Tesei.
already mentioned, feel free to misspell my name however you want. I mean, you should see what I feel so bad in this moment. I'm teaching in China near Shanghai, and I constantly literally butcher the names of my students, so I can't really ask the others to just properly pronounce my name.
Well, I do try, and I apologize, but I want everybody to make sure they go down in the description, get his book. You're going to want to check it out. Also the websites. I'm telling you, this has been a blast. We have a lot more to discuss here on MythVision. I hope you enjoyed yourself.
I did, and actually, you know, we were talking before recording, and I said that this is these broadcasts are really exceptional, and I told Derek that I plan to use some of the episodes for my classes next year. So you're making an excellent service.
Thank you so much. Never forget, ladies and gentlemen, we have ways of supporting us as well, but we are MythVision. Ladies and gentlemen, join MythVision's Patreon, not only to support us, but there are 72 videos that I did with Dr. Dennis R. McDonald and Richard Carrier, all on the Patreon, early access. You guys can ask personal questions when I go to interview these scholars, and you're helping MythVision grow.